and good evening, everybody. My name's Graham O'Brien. I'm one of the assistant chief driving examiners at DVSA. Been with the agency about 18 years now. Time flies. Prior to that, I was a driving instructor for about 5 years, so truly appreciate the great work that you folks do on a daily basis. Hopefully, you enjoy the webinar this evening. We did do one of these about a year ago. A couple of the things have changed, so hopefully you're going to get some value out of this evening. So thanks for joining us. I'll hand back over to Amanda.
We have the next slide, please. Thank you. So why is it important to discuss these reasons for the top 10 reasons for failure? So it's more than just about the driving test faults and passing the driving test. Many of these reasons are top contributing factors when and are reported in collisions. So understanding these reasons can help you assess if pupils have the skills, knowledge and understanding needed to be safe when they've passed the test, they're driving independently on their own, which is really important. And they give you a great way of exploring factors with your pupils that will increase risk in different scenarios. And it's that last point that's the most important here. We all probably have a very good understanding of what technically needs to be done, but digging into your pupils' understanding of risk can give you a much better sense of their thoughts, feelings and beliefs. And I'll hand over to Graham for the next slide.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we may have missed a slide there. Do we want to go back one?
It's
or...
this one, next one, just running through the risks.
Oh, okay. So in terms of the risks themselves, there's lots of things to factor into it. Fundamentally, your role as a driving instructor is to identify faults, analyse them, and then give that remedial advice, isn't it? But if you're looking at that through a coaching lens, which I'm sure many of you do, it's digging deeper into that, isn't it, to try to understand the behaviour from that person. Why was that fault? Why did that fault occur there? Was the contributing factors? When you adopting that coaching style, a real key part is that analysis, isn't it? And delving into that to try to use probing questions to understand if there was contributing factors. Is it a personality? Is there an overconfidence there? Was there some stress involved in leading to that particular fault? It's allowing your pupil to try to demonstrate using that good Q&A, isn't it, to get an understanding of their needs, so you equally can tailor your remedial advice to absolutely suit that person. Okay, I'll hand back to Amanda.
Next slide, please. So why might you want to use probing questions to explore people's thoughts and feelings? Because this helps their understanding, helps you understand what they understand, and it's a really good way to open up conversations and talk through what's going on. So you can start by asking, why do you think people fail to make effective observations at junctions? And then start probing into any risk factors your pupil mentions. You can just clarifying questions such as, if I've understood you correctly, are you saying that? And then repeat what they're said. And if you're not clear, and also to reassure them, that you're listening, so it shows them that you're listening to what they're saying and helping reiterate when it's the correct messaging. You can then go on to introduce other risk factors they haven't mentioned into the conversation and to see what they think and feel about those. So we'll keep the list of the risk factors in the corner of each slide as we progress, so you have them as a prompt. And as was said in the introduction, we'll make the recording of today's session available after. So if you want to recap any section later, you'll be able to do that. So now we're going to get into the top 10 and over to Graham.
Thank you. So a slight change to when we delivered this webinar last time. We started with the most common last time, but we thought it'd be interesting to start with number 10 and then do it down to number 1. So we finish with the most common reason. So in at number 10 is not driving at a safe and responsible speed. So we actually capture this under the heading of use of speed on the test report. Sometimes people get confused about use of speed and appropriate speed. Quite simply, use of speed is too quick, appropriate speed is too slow. So we're looking at too quick in this example. I guess it's not surprising to many that occasionally people breach the speed limit. I don't think there's anybody on this call, if we're honest, that hasn't breached the speed limit accidentally at one time or another. But it's not just about breaching the speed limit. It's about driving at an appropriate speed for the road and traffic conditions. You know as well as I do as sitting at the side of drivers, learners in particular. You don't need to necessarily look at the speed limit or the speedometer to know when that person's breaching the speed. It feels too quick. So we're not always looking at, once somebody's gone over the speed limit, it could just be the fact that they're driving too quick for the road and traffic conditions. For example, you could be passing a school. There could be some children at the side of the school. The speed limit's 30. The actual pupil, the candidate, is driving at 30, but actually it's too fast for the road and traffic conditions. You and I would adjust our speed accordingly because of the risk. So it's delving into that to understand why is that person actually thinking this speed is appropriate in this environment, and it's using those open-ended questions to try to understand that and put some coping strategies in place to identify the risk. So speed, as we've just mentioned, is a common fault we see on the driving test. It's the 10th most common one, not always just for breaching the speed limit, quite often for driving over a speed that is safe and responsible for that environment. I'll hand back to Amanda for number 9.
So number 9, poor positioning on the road during normal driving. So this is about where we position as we drive, obviously. So this could come into being too close to the curb or too close to the centre line. So it's about where we maintain that centre position. And if we're too close to the left or too close to the right, the risk increases. And because the risk increases, then obviously the faults can be assessed accordingly. The other ones we see quite a bit of is staying in the right-hand lane on dual carriageways. So many roundabouts now have got 2 lanes that go around them and lead off them. And quite often if the candidate ends up in the right-hand lane, your pupil, they don't always realise that they need to move back to the left when it's safe to do so, and they carry on along in the right-hand lane for quite some distance. And on some of these national speed limit dual carriageways, the risk here becomes really high because we're backing the traffic up behind us. Then cars start to pass us on the left-hand side, and all of that contributes to the risk. And it will get to the stage where we will ask them to move back over when it's safe to do so. So it's always about that moving back to the left when it's safe. And like I say, the faults that are quite commonly marked because they've been led into the right-hand lane due to the way the road system's laid out, and they haven't looked to see that they need to move back to the left. Cutting across normal road position on roundabouts, so you probably know this as straight lining. The police actually use this, but they use this with a lot of experience and vision and checking all around and observations. Quite often what we see with novice drivers is they'll straight line around about without any checks at all. There'll be other traffic around them, the traffic will be too big, the risk will be too high to be doing that in those situations. So this is about encouraging them to stay in their lane, and this is about the ones quite often where they don't have road markings. And I don't know about the areas you're from, but I know where I'm from at the moment, the road markings are pretty poor. So there aren't the road markings, so we would expect them to maintain their position as though there weren't any. So if you're going to go ahead and you're in that left-hand lane as you join the roundabout, you'd expect to maintain that position in that left lane to leave. And quite often what we find is they're cutting across into that right lane. They're not taking any checks around to ensure it's safe, and then the risk is really high there. So we would be marking that as a serious fault. So there's a little bit about poor positioning on the road during normal driving. And I'll hand back to Graham.
Thank you. So number 8, not responding correctly to road marking. So Amanda touched on this a little bit in some of her description on the previous one, but particularly road markings. So, and again, there's nobody on the call who hasn't found themselves in that position, right? You might be in an unfamiliar place, you might be approaching a roundabout, you find yourself in a left turn only lane where your intention was to go ahead. What do you do? Well, that's the same thing that you see on a daily basis with your students, and you're giving them techniques to deal with that. However, on a driving test, it's difficult to find that kind of calmness and make the right decision. So if somebody was to go ahead from a left-only lane, that potentially is going to lead to a fault regarding on the scenario at the time and what's actually happening. I think it's worth clarifying, just briefly. We assess faults in terms of if somebody deviates from what we would define as the defined outcome, so what we would expect to do, and that's set in the highway code and the essential driving skills. So we wouldn't expect somebody to go ahead from a left-only turn lane. So if you were faced in that position, the chances are it's going to result in a fault on the test, and quite a common one. I think it's worth clarifying as well. Amanda touched on if the road markings are faint, or they might be covered, or you might be following a vehicle which is covering the road markings and you can't see. That's where we'd expect the examiner to give some assistance in terms of the customer, just to tell them which lane they need to be in if it's not clear. So we would deal with that just like you would on a lesson. But obviously, as you get closer to test standard and you're allowing your pupil to drive independently, you're wanting to see them make those decisions on their own. So straddling lanes on roundabouts is a common thing that we see. Crossing double white lines where the line near you is a solid one. Ignoring box junctions and not following road markings at mini roundabouts. So those are some of the common ones. You might think, why would mini roundabouts come under road markings? Well, that's because the arrows that go around the mini roundabout, if somebody was just to, drive over the mini roundabout without making some attempt to go around it, that would be marked under road markings. Of course, we allow for the fact that it's difficult to negotiate a mini roundabout, so there's some flexibility there. But if somebody was to just ignore it, then it would be marked under road markings. Quite a common one on the driving test there, as we say. So I'll hand back to Amanda for the next one.
Thanks, Graham. So this leads on a little bit from road markings, and that's not responding correctly to traffic signs. So quite similar about not following the rules of the road. So for traffic signs, quite often it is about going the wrong side of a keep left sign. And these could be the big signs, or it could be even the little ones on the bollards coming off roundabouts. And quite often this might happen at traffic lights where there's big traffic light junctions, and they're turning right and they'll try and turn too soon, so they're coming into the traffic that's facing us. So that's quite a common one, is not going the correct side of the keep left sign. Ignoring a stop or a no entry sign. So there's a little bit of a myth that we've heard before about you've got to put your handbrake on at a stop sign. It's not the case, but you do have to bring the car to a complete stop. And that's a legal requirement to bring the car to a complete stop at a stop line, regardless of whether we think the visibility is good or we can see on approach, so we don't need to worry. We would still expect that complete stop at a stop line. And because if they don't, it's a legal breach, then that would be assessed accordingly. The same with no entry signs. We do get some people that will try to turn into a road that's got clear no entry signs. So it's about helping them to understand, the signs and what the expectations are with those. Driving in a bus lane, some of these are timed, so they need to be aware of that. But a lot of them are 24-hour in the bigger cities, and driving in those bus lanes would result in a serious fault because they are expected to not enter those, as we all are as drivers. Choosing the wrong lane at a roundabout with clear signage. So quite often on approach to roundabouts, there are signs that will show you which lane you need to be in. I know a lot of roundabouts now, you can turn right from the left lane in certain places, but again, you'd only be able to do this with clear signage to show you that that's what's allowed to happen. And so it's about making sure you're in that correct lane on approach to the roundabout, and then following that through that roundabout as expected to do so. The other one's speed limit changes. So we do sometimes get this where people just haven't noticed the speed limit change and they will carry on through a 30, maybe doing 40 or higher. You can't let this progress too quickly before we might have to advise them that they've gone through that speed limit change and ask them to reduce their speed. So it's just about looking out for the signs and following them. And again, if we've got signs that are covered or they're not clear, we would expect the examiner to give some advice and guidance if that was needed at that time. But we'd like to think that a lot of the mandatory signs, the stop, the no entry, they should all be clear anyway. And if not, then we probably like to think that we probably wouldn't have them on the routes. So, and I'll pass back to you, Graham.
Thank you. So number 6, not having proper control of the steering. So as I'm sure you'd expect, this obviously features in the top 10. It's happening all the time, isn't it? It's a fundamental part of driving and manoeuvring the vehicle, isn't it? Having control of the steering. And as speaking as an ex-instructor, it can be quite tricky, can't it? Teaching some people the correct way to steer the vehicle comes naturally to others, and not so much to all. But if we look at some of the reasons why faults are marked on a driving test, we're looking at not steering enough or steering late when we're approaching junctions, not steering enough when going around a bend, steering late when turning right into a minor road, repeatedly mounting the pavement, and steering late when going around parked vehicles. So you can see there's a little bit of a pattern there in terms of we're using the word repeatedly quite a lot. So quite often this fault, in terms of steering, it could accumulate into an habitual fault and result in a serious fault if we're seeing, quite a few examples of deficiencies within the steering under some of these topics, albeit they'd all be marked under steering. Quite often one of the things we see is, students on test not really allowing themselves enough time for the MSM. It's almost like when they get to the steering part, they're too much on top of the junction, which results in either late or, erratic steering, pulling up at the side of the road, probably the one you folks don't like the most, with those nice alloy wheels when we're just giving them a scuff down the wheel, down the curb there. But quite often, this would lead to a serious fault through repeated faults. It's not that common to see a one-off serious fault, let's say, for steering. It's more often, a number of things that ultimately result in habitual faults. So, yeah, steering, unsurprisingly, features as number 6 in the top 10. So I will hand back to Amanda.
Thanks, Graham. So number 5, halfway through, not responding appropriately to traffic lights. Now, this one would sound a little bit obvious, you may think, but I'm not sure it always is. So this is about going through a red light when you shouldn't, or not going on a green light when you should. So what we're finding a little bit of is roundabouts now, quite a few of them are traffic light controlled. And as you and us as experienced drivers, you're probably scanning the whole roundabout and you're looking for those lights and you're aware of what's coming ahead of you. Quite often for a novice driver, they're looking at the light in front of them. So the light in front of them will go green. They'll be turning right on the roundabout. What they won't pick up is the next set of lights aren't green, because to them, they've got the green light and they're off to go. So I think there is a little bit to be said now about these traffic light roundabouts and the fact that they need to be, like I say, it's quite obvious to you and I, but I think for novice drivers, it's about helping them understand that we need to be looking at every set as we go, because unfortunately they're quite often not that far apart, but will be a different colour. And also, if they're looking to leave a roundabout, quite often they're busy checking their mirrors, they're looking to get in the right lane. What they haven't noticed is that next set of lights is on red. So again, it's about doing that work and bringing that experience up in that space. Not stopping at a red traffic light. So we've just gone through that on roundabouts, but that can come up on all manner of roads. But what we also get is people that stop at green lights. So again, they're busy checking their mirrors, they might be changing lane, and to them, they've just seen a white line, they've stopped. What they haven't noticed is on approach, the lights have now gone green. And because they're busy doing other things, they haven't noticed, time's passed on, the traffic's building behind, and they're not reacting to those green lights. And it could get to the stage where we need to advise them they need to move off, to prevent other people trying to get around us. Some traffic lights, they've got 2 stop lines, and what's not always happening is not always stopping at the first one. So the first one is for the driver, and then there's the box in front quite often for cyclists. And we wouldn't expect them to go over that first white line. That is the stop line. That's the legal requirement for them to stop in that position. Not progressing when you're waiting to turn right at a junction. So again, this depends on the size of the junction, whether it's got a right turn box in the middle, if it's safe to proceed and they can go all the way through and turn right, no problem, whether they can move into that middle space. So it's about scanning and planning really on approach as to where they can put the car and where it's safe to go. Not going ahead when the light is green and the junction head is clear. So we just ran through that a minute ago, that quite often does happen. And again, it's maybe because they're being distracted by other things around them, and they're not watching the lights. The other thing, what does happen is quite often when they're waiting to turn right at traffic lights, they'll see the head arrow go green and they'll go to move off. And we do see that quite a bit, and we have to ask them to stop because their light is still red. So It's about making sure we're following the light that's appropriate to us, and helping them understand that. That's that for me. Over to you, Graham.
Thank you. So number 4, incorrect positioning when turning right at junctions. So obviously turning right is much more complex than turning left. We get very few faults. We see very few faults for turning left, but turning right, obviously, as I say, comes with much more complexity. So unsurprisingly, we do see a number of faults when pupils are turning right. Some of the common ones, not taking the correct position, keeping over to the left when turning right on a roundabout, for example, and delving into why this happens. Is it just the nerves kicking in? Quite often it can be. That can be a factor. So how do you deal with that in terms of coping strategies for your students? Is it something that you need to delve that little bit deeper, just to say, listen, if you're turning right and you find yourself similar to road markings in the incorrect position before you're about to turn right, what are your options? Are your options to go ahead or turn left? Well, that would be much better, wouldn't it, than committing to the right turn from the incorrect position. So it's trying to always assess that risk as well, isn't it? Because if you think about the risk of turning right from the left-hand lane of a roundabout, I mean, you'd probably think, does that really happen? Unfortunately, it does. We do see that fault. And like I mentioned there, it's attached to quite a high risk, isn't it? If you add another vehicle into that equation, quite often it could lead to the examiner having to take some kind of intervention to avoid a collision in that situation. Other things we see, obstructing traffic when you're waiting to turn right, so not taking the correct position, basically, either overshooting the junction or crossing the centre line when you're coming up from a minor to major turn. When you want to turn right at the end of the road, you're incorrectly positioned to the left. So lots of these faults, you could say, well, is that a steering fault? But we try to simplify it in terms of what the person's doing at that time. To give you a little bit of inside knowledge, I suppose, what we say to our examiners, if they're not sure where that fault marks, quite often ask yourself, how would you debrief that fault to a customer? So I would debrief that fault. The first line would be, on one occasion, when you were turning right. That then leads me to where the location of the fault is. So a popular one we see quite often, it can be linked to poor steering as well, but the fact that the person's turning right, that's where we would ultimately download that fault on the driving test report. Okay, I'll hand back over to Amanda.
Thank you. So number 3, moving away safely. So you'll not be surprised to know this has probably been in the top 10 for quite some time. So this comes down to when we're moving away from the side of the road, when we're moving away after an emergency stop. And that could be moving away from the side of the road after a normal stop, or it could be after the right reverse. So quite often this comes down to blind spot checks, and we hear and we see actually quite a lot of people that are looking all around, sort of doing a 6-point check and various other things. As an examiner, what I'm mostly looking for is that they're aware of what the traffic is doing around them. So that's the traffic coming up from behind and approaching, any traffic that's coming from ahead, and also what's going on in their right blind spot area if they're moving away from the left, to make sure it's safe to do so. And then also when moving away from the right side of the road, you probably would check a little even more around to your left, because you're going to cross over that traffic and it's even harder to see in the mirrors that what's going on. So it quite often ends up being a habitual fault. So if somebody's missed a blind spot check in an area that would be reasonable to expect one, then it could be a driver fault. This could then go on to be a habitual fault if throughout the test they don't really check any blind spot checks. So mirrors themselves aren't enough. There is an area to our right that isn't picked up by our mirrors. So we still would still expect them to be checking that area if it's required to do so. Same with an emergency stop. If we've done an emergency stop and we've stopped in the centre of the road, quite often people get in the car ready to go and say, okay, when you're ready, you can drive on. And they just drive on, no checks around, of any mirrors or anything to ensure it's safe. And obviously that's really high risk. We might not have been stopped very long, but we've probably stopped long enough for the road and traffic conditions to change. So again, that's where we may then need to assess the fault. So yeah, those right blind spot checks are key, especially when they're required to be. And then checking around following the emergency stop. But yeah, over to you, Greg.
Thank you. So number two, okay, and this is the only one that features under mirrors, and it's not using mirrors correctly when changing direction. So I'm sure most of you folks are aware we've got three mirror boxes that we can assess against on our test report, well, on the digital test report on the iPad. And they are not checking your mirrors before signalling, not checking your mirrors before changing speed, and not checking your mirrors before changing direction. So why does this one feature in the top 10 and the others don't? Well, it's simply down to risk. If you think about it, if I asked you to take the next road on the left and you didn't check your mirrors, the risk of that, but you did signal, the risk of that is pretty low. If I asked you to pull up on the left, you signaled but you didn't check your mirror, that would be mirror change speed. Again, the risk of that is relatively low. However, if I asked you to change lanes on a dual carriageway, and you didn't check your mirrors before changing direction from the left lane to the right lane, the risk of that is much higher. So ultimately, that's why this one features in the top 10. We can see some of the examples there. Not using mirrors when exiting a roundabout, that would come under change direction. Of course, the risk is very high. That's where it gives the examiner a little bit of a heart flutter when somebody goes to change direction without checking any mirrors whatsoever. It just makes sure they're wide awake during the test. Causing a vehicle to slow when changing lanes on a dual carriageway, again, it jumps off the page, doesn't it, as being high risk. And it's one, again, that you will see on your lessons where you're ultimately, either grabbing the wheel or turning around and looking over your shoulder as quick as you can because of the risk. Trying to change lanes on a roundabout when a vehicle is directly alongside you, because sometimes, and you know this as well as I, people, students, can check the mirrors, but they don't react to what they see. That's the one that really, that's difficult to get your head around, isn't it? They do the checks, but they actually still want to change direction into the position where another vehicle could be. So we would still mark that under changing direction. Even though they've checked, they've not reacted to what's there. So again, this is risk, isn't it? And this is where you're using those open-ended questions when somebody demonstrates a fault like that to really understand, firstly, where in terms of your self-preservation allows you to do it. Was it just you forgot? Were you distracted? Were you, was it the workload that allowed you to make that fundamental mistake? But it's really trying to unpack that, isn't it? To put some remedial in place to hopefully stop that from happening again. But we can see that's why mirror change direction is the one that features in the top 10, even though we probably get more faults in the other categories in terms of mirror signal because people are doing that all the time, when they're turning in and out side roads. But the change direction is the one that carries the most risk, and that's why it features in the top 10 at number 2. Okay, I'll hand back over to Amanda for number 1.
Thanks, Graham. So you'll be pleased to know this is number 1, and it's not making effective observations at junctions. So you probably won't be surprised to see this as number 1, and I think we've seen it as number 1 quite repeatedly over time. And you think this one was quite obvious, and to you and I, it probably does seem a little bit obvious as experienced drivers, but actually that top one there about judging of speed is the key one. My local test centre, we join a dual carriageway at 70 mile an hour dual carriageway. There isn't a slipway. It's really good visibility of the traffic coming from our right, but they always seem surprised by the speed of that traffic, and it does get misjudged easily. So that's quite a common thing, is to misjudge the speed of an approaching vehicle. And that could be at a junction, and also some of our roundabouts that are quite a bit bigger, the traffic's moving much quicker than our smaller, busier roundabouts, and again, that can be misjudged, resulting in other vehicles having to reduce their speed or brake suddenly, or us having to take action if possible to brake the car to a stop to stop them joining the roundabout in front of those vehicles. No effective observations at all. So that's an interesting one, isn't it? And quite often that might happen at unmarked crossroads or junctions that haven't realised they're a junction. And to them, they're just following the road and they haven't noticed that they're at a junction and that they need to be taking observations. Looking too late, that's quite a key one as well. And quite often that's if you're turning left, they'll be looking to the right. Because they're watching the traffic coming from their right, and actually they're already now out with quite a lot of the car out across the give way lines, onto the road without any checks to the left at that point. So the risk there, the further out they're going, the time that's progressing, the risk is increasing all the time until they move their eyes back round to the left. Could have been a car overtaking another car, all sorts of things. So the time and distance there is key. We're not talking sort of a foot over, but and then as it progresses, the risk increases, and because the risk increases, obviously we assess that accordingly. So making effective observations at junctions is still number one. What I'll do now is I'll hand back to John, I think it is.
Thanks, Amanda and Graham. Really good run through there of those top 10 reasons, and thank you for bringing them to life with some very real examples that I think we can all relate to. Also, a really, really good explanation there of the importance of using coaching questions and using those to explore those risk factors. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us on those points. We're now going to open up the question and answer session. So if you look on the device that you're using to access this, whether it's your phone or a laptop or a computer, you should see that the question and answer box has now opened up. So towards the top right of your screen, usually there's a little button that says Q&A. So you can now start to add your questions in there. For today, because we are short on time, please keep your questions on the topic of the top 10 driving test faults that Graham and Amanda have been talking us through today. And to help them answer your questions, please try and keep them as short and concise as possible. We won't publish any duplicate questions because with over 700 of you here, we're sure that some of you have probably got a question that's the same as someone else. So if there are any duplicate questions, we won't be publishing duplicates. And once a question has been answered, we'll delete it from the list of questions that you can see on your screen. There's also a way against each question. There's a little thumb icon so you can actually like each question. So if there's a question that you would really like to see answered, please like the question, and then that will help us as we go through and try and answer the most popular questions first. So I'm going to pass over then, and we'll go to our first question, which is from Ian. Thank you, Ian. And Ian asks if there are some areas that are worse for certain mistakes than others.
Thanks for the question, Ian. I think, it's a good question. And I think the top 10 highlights that, doesn't it, in terms of some of the areas that are worse than others. I'd maybe want you to elaborate on that slightly, but I guess in terms of what you're saying and what you've heard us talk about a lot there is risk. And I think it'd be quite interesting for you folks to understand just a little bit more insight into how we as examiners assess these faults. And like I said, you hear us talk about risk a lot. That's a real big, what we call one of the rules and tools of assessment in terms of how our examiners are trained to assess these faults. We, like I mentioned during the slides, we basically, we employ a fault-based assessment, similar to what you do in your everyday training, where your customers, your pupils, will ultimately make mistakes. You identify those mistakes, you analyse those mistakes, and you provide remedial action. You're doing that through hopefully a coaching lens by you're saying very little and they're saying the majority of it. So on a driving test, you might look at the examiner if you sit in the back, and hopefully you do, and you might think, oh, they look like they're relatively calm, they're not really doing much. And hopefully that's the case, but upstairs they're thinking constantly, that they're analysing these faults, they're identifying them. Getting a clear, accurate account of the fault is key for the examiner to get that clear, accurate account. Then they will analyse the fault using the rules and tools of assessment. Risk is one of them. Before any examiner would mark a serious fault, they'd have to consider risk. The other things they consider is the defined outcome. Perfect. How far from the defined outcome was the fault? And we're expecting people to deviate from the defined outcome, right? Because they're novice drivers, they're learners. Not only novice drivers, but all drivers deviate from the defined outcome. That's why we have a scale of assessment. So how far from the defined outcome was that fault? Was it what we call a not worthy fault? Was it, insufficient? Was it an insufficient deviation from the defined outcome, or was it a sufficient deviation? If it was, then potentially it could be what we call a driving fault. If it's a significant deviation, then potentially we're looking at a serious fault. Other things we ask ourselves is, what can we add and take away? Was there any other vehicles involved? Was any other road users involved? So there's quite a lot of these rules and tools of assessment that the examiner will go into quite a lot of detail in their mind before they download any of the faults on there. But some are more obvious than others. And coming back to the question, we see things more common, as you do on your lessons, you see common repeated faults. And we see that in certain locations as well, faults that are repeated more often. But every time a fault is committed, the examiner will go through that process of using that rules and tools of assessment, analysing the fault to before they put finger to iPad to download that fault. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Graham. Our next question it asks whether or not we will be getting a CPD certificate for joining today's webinar. We don't actually have a CPD certificate planned for today's event, but it's a great question, and really pleasing to see that people are thinking about their CPD, and we would encourage you to add it to your CPD log and to reflect on it. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Amanda?
No, that's correct, John. So yeah, if you can log it on your log, as it were, that you've attended today, definitely, because it just shows that you're engaging with us. So it's good.
Thanks, Amanda. I'll just take the next question as one. So I work in the communications team, so hopefully I can help with this one, which is where will the recording be posted? Because someone's had trouble finding them in the past. So we will publish the recording of this on the Dispatch blog. We'll pop a link into the chat towards the end of the webinar just to give you quick access to those, but you can find recordings of previous webinars there. And because we've got your email addresses as well, because we use those to invite you this evening, we will email you to let you know once the recording and the slides are available. The next one that I've got is about, and I think, Graham, you maybe touched on this a little bit about habitual faults when you were speaking earlier. It was about how many repeated faults lead to a serious or a dangerous fault. Could you take that one for us, please?
Certainly can, and it's a really great question, actually. And this forms quite a good chunk of our training of the examiners in terms of habitual faults. And it comes back to risk. It absolutely does. And sometimes, when I do some staff training as well, and occasionally I'll use the analogy of, you might be playing a video game and you get so many lives. When you lose a life, it depends on the fault that's committed. So, for example, if I said to you, take the next road on the left, and you didn't check your mirrors, but you signalled, well, that would be a fault. But it would be a very low-risk fault in terms of, in the big picture, you've signalled, you've slowed down, you've checked your gears. The only thing you didn't do was didn't check your mirrors before you signalled. Generally, if somebody does that, they will repeat that. They've either forgot, or it's just whatever it might be on the day, it might be nerves. So they repeatedly do that. So because that fault is so low risk, back to the video game analogy, it would take quite a while for that life, if you like, to be fully emitted, for that to go out. On some video games, you'll get 3 lives. On that particular one, because the risk, unless we can add something to the fault, somebody was affected, that if somebody was affected, that might make one of those lives go out a little bit quicker. Hopefully you're following this. I will bring it round. But let's say, for example, they've done that repeatedly. Eventually you're asking yourself, when is this person showing a significant deficiency within this competence to warrant a serious fault? When it's a low-risk fault, you're obviously going to allow that to happen more before it becomes serious. Now, imagine something a little bit more high risk. Somebody, you're asking them to turn right at the roundabout. It requires them to get from the left lane to the right lane. You and I would check our centre mirror, right mirror, and consider a blind spot. The blind spot isn't necessary, but you'd consider it. Let's imagine somebody only checks the centre mirror and changes lanes. There's no one around, there's no one affected. Now, coming back to that deviation from the defined outcome, that's further than the example I just provided about the mirror signal. It's still without anybody affected would only be what we call a driving fault. However, I wouldn't want to see somebody do that very often. That would take out quite a lot of the life. So if somebody did that again, that's now getting to a significant deviation much quicker. Ultimately, what I'm saying is it depends on the risk. So there's no set number. It should be assessed in terms of once somebody's shown a significant deficiency within that competence. And each individual fault will be assessed on its own merits. So hopefully that answers the question. But it is a really good question, and there's no set answer. And there shouldn't be a set answer with assessment, because assessment is just that. You assess each individual fault on its own merit. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham, for that answer, and thank you, Nick, for the question. A lot of people did like that one. We'll take our next question now, which comes from Lucy. And Lucy says that earlier you mentioned that mounting the curb in relation to positioning. And Lucy asks, is any mount of the curb a fail? Do you want to take that on for us, Amanda?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question, Lucy. It's a good question, isn't it? Because is any mount of a curb a fail? So this would now depend on, are we driving? So are we driving at any speed? Are we reversing very slowly? So it would come down again back to that assessment. So if we're reversing at an extremely slow speed and it's a slightly lowered curve and we've come up on the very edge of it and then we've corrected the position to complete the manoeuvre, you probably wouldn't see a serious fault for that, because we've corrected it and we're knowingly knew we were on the curve and done something about it. If we're doing a reverse even at slow speed and actually we've now got the revs up quite high and got the clutch up to try and mount the curve, which does sometimes happen, and actually because now it's got some extra gas on, as it's gone over the curve, it's now shot back on the pavement. Well, again, that fault progresses and that risk progresses, and that moves on through the scales. So is any mount of the curb a fail? Again, if we're driving forward, quite often coming off roundabouts, they might mistake steering, and we could quite go up and mount a curb at quite a speed. And again, we might only just mount the curb by an inch or two, but the speed we're traveling, the risk is much, much higher. So it would come down to each individual circumstance. It would come down to speed, the height of the curb, what was happening at the time, did we need to be there, all those sorts of things. So is any mount of the curb a fail? Probably not, if we're reversing at a very slow speed and it's a lowered curb and we've done something about it. If we're travelling at speed and we mount a curb leaving a roundabout, then yeah, it probably would be a fail because of the risks and everything associated with that. So hopefully that helps. Thanks, Lucy.
Thanks, Amanda, for that answer. We'll move to our next question, which is back on the topic of steering and about control. And this question asks that a person has heard that allowing the steering to spin through your fingers when you turn back into the road, and this person said no, there's no control involved in that. Can you confirm that that's the case, please?
Yeah, in terms of, thanks for the question. In terms of no control, does that mean we don't mark a fault? I suppose it's one of those myths, isn't it? It's a little bit like dry steering, just steering. Whilst it's not best practice, what we're looking for was any loss of control during that. So let's say, for example, again, sometimes a little bit of an analogy we might use it for a driving examiner assessing somebody on a test. Let's imagine we drew a curtain between the examiner and the customer, the pupil. They were turning right, they came out of the junction, on straightening up, they just let the wheel spin. Would I notice any loss of control in the vehicle if I wasn't watching what they did with the steering wheel? If the answer to that is no, then largely you're looking at there would be no fault to assess. It would be a fault because, let's face it, it's not best practice. Would you or I do it? I certainly wouldn't. I would keep control of the wheel because that's best practice. Well, that's why we've got that scale of assessment, because the first fault on the scale of assessment is what we call not worthy. It's deviated from the defined outcome. However, it's not worthy of recording because it was insignificant. It's the same as, like I said, dry steering, driving with one hand on the wheel. It's not ideal, and it's certainly not best practice. But in terms of a fault, we could quite easily mark that. And I think that's sometimes why when you folks do your mock tests and ultimately, you might end up with, let's say, 10 driving faults on the mock test. Your student comes for the driving test and they pass with 3 driving faults. That's largely because, and don't take this the wrong way, but you fault mark. We assess faults. So you'll see a fault and say, oh, that's wrong. And quite right, you should fault mark. You should correct those. But in terms of assessment, quite rightly, we don't fault mark. We've got that level of flexibility to allow for those insignificant deviations. Hopefully that helps answer the question.
Thank you, Graham. We'll move on to our next question, which asks, if we can ask learners to creep halfway when turning right at a busy junction.
That's a good question, isn't it? So, can we ask people to creep halfway? Well, I'm staying in Bristol tonight, and we were heading over here from the office earlier. It was really busy, and actually, there was no traffic coming from the right at the time. But if we didn't start to creep onto that side of the road, we wouldn't have been able to nip in the gap on the traffic coming from the left. So it all comes down to judgment, doesn't it? And are we impacting the people approaching from the right? Can we fit into the? Can we already identify that gap in the traffic coming from the left? So if I creep out now across the road a bit, I know that I can get into that gap that's coming from my left before encroaching on the traffic from the right. So quite often we do see a little bit more of this in the cities, and I expect in London, in some situations, I expect there's places that if you don't do this, you're likely to be able to get out. But then where, in smaller towns where I test, we wouldn't expect this to happen because there wouldn't be the need for it because the roads aren't as busy. What I also find quite often is when it is busy and there's quite a lot of traffic and it's slow moving, a lot of people will let you out. They'll see that you're waiting to come out, and they'll judge the fact that you need to come across in front of them and things like that. So can you ask them to do it? Again, it's about judging the traffic. If it's safe to do it and you're not impacting the traffic from the right and you've got that gap coming from your left and it means that it's all quite seamless, then yeah, it would make sense to start creeping out, wouldn't it? So you could grab that opportunity because it might be your only one for a little while. I hope that's helped. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think just adding to that, because it's a really, really good question, and what my response to that usually is, what would you do? What would you do in that situation? Because if you're at that junction and you come up to it and there's quite a bit of traffic, you're not going to creep immediately. You're going to assess the situation. You're going to see, like Amanda says, if it then becomes clear from one direction, obviously not from the right, because if you're going to creep, you're going to force somebody to stop. But after a while, and again, there's no one on this call who hasn't done that at one point or another because it's the best course of action. Yes, you're on a test. Yes, you're going to be assessed. But equally, there needs to be a level of what would you do in that situation? It's not about passing a test, is it? It's about giving someone a skill for life. And it's about, the certain situations when ultimately you do have to do something like that. You do have to just creep out slightly just to enable somebody to allow you to go. So I think a really good thing is to always ask yourself, what would you do? So yeah, real good question.
Thanks, Amanda and Graham, for that answer. That's really helpful. We'll move on to our next question, which comes from Steph. And Steph asks if you could advise on if a blind spot check is necessary when leaving a roundabout, as there seems to be some inconsistencies on this.
Yeah, good question. Blind spot when leaving a roundabout. And again, it's just going to come right back to what I've just said. What would you do? Now, let me think about the last 10 or 12 roundabouts I've negotiated in the last couple of days. Did I check a blind spot coming off any of them? I think I did on one. And it was when Amanda and I were just coming back to the hotel. We're in Bristol. It's quite a busy one. And the reason I checked is because there could have been someone there and it was busy. There was lots of traffic on it. Did I need to check it? It was for my self-preservation. I checked the centre mirror and I checked the left. Now, that was probably sufficient, but on that occasion, I felt it was necessary just to take that little look to the left as well, just to ensure none of the traffic was encroaching into the space I wanted to move into. So I don't think we should be teaching, it needs to be on a case-by-case basis, doesn't it, in terms of, it's similar to like what I mentioned previously when we're changing lanes on a dual carriageway. How often do you check your blind spot when you're doing that? The answer should be when it's necessary. And it's not always necessary. You could be travelling on that dual carriageway at midnight and you've not seen another car. You're updating your mirrors frequently. You check your centre mirror and your right door mirror. You change lanes if necessary. Is a blind spot required? Not in that situation. So it's difficult to give, and I will always try and give an answer as honestly as I can. But I think the answer there is it's on a case-by-case basis. But equally, it's very few and far between, isn't it, when a blind spot is necessary to exit a roundabout. As long as the mirror use has been good approaching and throughout the roundabout, then more often than not, it's not necessary unless the situation demands it.
Thanks, Graham. I'm going to take two questions now, actually, because they're on a bit of a topic, and they're both about bay parking. So, Amanda, if you wouldn't mind handling both of these for us, and Graham coming in if you've got anything else to add. The first part is whether or not a pupil can ask an examiner to check if they are actually parked within the bay. And then our second question is whether it's a fail if the wheels are on the white line, and what if the wheels have not been straightened on a parking manoeuvre?
Yeah, thanks, John. So, can people ask an examiner about if they're in the bay? Yeah, of course they can. You need to make sure the car's secure. If they were to get out to check, I'd ask them to actually switch the car off. If they were just going to open the door, I'd ask them to secure the car with the handbrake. What we sometimes find at the moment is candidates, they're being trained to use auto hold a lot, and then so they'll ask to check whether they're in the bay, and I ask them to put the handbrake on, and they'll tell me they don't know how to do that. So that's obviously a little bit more of a concern for them. But as long as they can secure the car safely, then I have no issues with them checking if they're in the bay, if that's what they want to do. As for white lines, wheels on the white line and straightening up the wheels, I mean, would it be a serious fault? No, it wouldn't. If they've come back in one and the wheels are on the line, I mean, there may be other factors in there that could still result in it being a serious fault. They could have took 5 or 6 attempts. Might not have checked around while they're reversing, all those sorts of things. But I mean, if they've come back in one and the wheels are on the white lines, then to answer the question, no. But and about the wheels being straight, so best practice for all of us, whether in a test or not, is to always park with our wheels straight, especially if I've reverse parked on the road. Personally, I'd always make sure my wheels are straight, because if someone comes too close to the car, they've got the potential to hit my wheel with theirs and do some damage that actually I might not be aware about because I wasn't there at the time. So in regards to the test, it's not so much about the straightening of the wheels as long as the car's in the position as expected. But for good practice going forward, I would suggest that yes, they did have the wheels straight, because obviously that helps them later on in their driving career. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Amanda. Next one, it's not actually a question, but I just wanted to give a shout out to Les, who's a new PDI who's joined us this evening and has given us some nice feedback on the presentation. So thank you for joining us, Les, and I'm sure everyone here joins in wishing you success as you qualify to become an ADI, and thank you for choosing it as your career to help people stay safe on our roads. We've got just a couple of minutes left, so what I'm going to do is just see if we can take 2 questions quite quickly now. So the first one is from Neil, and it's just about clarifying about turning right at traffic lights when there's a green traffic light and a green arrow. Can the student turn right on the green light before the green arrow shows up?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Thanks, Neil. And definitely reiterate what John just said there to our new PDI. Both you folks and us, I think, have got the best jobs in the world because we get the opportunity to share in one of the most joyous moments that people have in their life, which is passing the test. So, yeah, definitely entering into the right career. So, back to the question. I think, yeah, it's a good question. And I think everything's different. Let's first of all establish it's the fact that you can turn right before the filter light comes on, because every light situation might be slightly different. If it is, absolutely, we're going to want to see somebody react to that light where ultimately we're going to move forward and take the correct position. If it's clear, we're going to immediately turn. If somebody doesn't react to that, I think we all know as well those lights that don't trigger the filter if you don't move forward. Quite often it then goes back to red in some situations, doesn't it? And again, that could lead to a potential serious fault because we're going to hold up the following traffic and miss a sequence of lights. So if the lights come to green and it's allowing us to turn, then by all means we should be reacting that, moving into the correct position and turning when it's safe.
Thank you, Graham. And just one final question, because we started talking earlier in the webinar about the importance of coaching conversations and using those open-ended questions and then probing in to questions. A question from Joe just asks, how could you actually go about practically asking an open-ended question relating to risk when you're having a learner analyse a fault?
I'll take that one, Graham.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a really good question, isn't it? And I think, from my perspective there, it's asking somebody what the potential outcome could be. I think it's establishing, first of all, get an understanding that that person's got a clear, accurate account of the event. That's the first thing you've got to do. Whatever it might be, ask them what their understanding was. They might have thought there was somebody there and there wasn't, or vice versa. So I would always want to establish what their version of events were. Just talk me through what your thoughts were there when you were going to change lanes on the dual carriageway. Tell me what mirrors do you think you needed to check? Why? What would happen if you didn't? What's the potential risk? What could the outcome could be? You're basically giving them a platform to tell you what's in their mind. It should be very, you're just trying to understand the thought process. Forgive me for teaching you how to suck eggs here. I know the vast majority of people here, and it is a really good question. Are you using this kind of Q&A on a daily basis? It's your fundamentals, isn't it? But first of all, my advice would be trying to establish what's in that person's mind. Get a clear, accurate account, because quite often that can be slightly, not quite accurate. So if they don't give you an accurate account, you plug the gap by saying, well, actually, there was a car there or there wasn't, whatever it might be. Then ask them, based on those actual events, what do you think the risk would have been? So, yeah, hopefully that helps. And just to finally say, we did this last year, and I thought it was great, and the questions and the attendees look really good. I think this is the kind of thing, hopefully, John's going to ask you in a moment for some feedback. If you did enjoy it and you'd like to do this kind of thing more, please let us know, because, we're more than happy to do these kind of things. And it's all about building them relationships. We're all on the same team. So, yeah, just thanks for your attendance. I'll hand back over to John.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. Just to echo what Graham has said, at points this evening, we've had about 750 of you with us. So thank you so much for giving up your time and joining us this evening. Could I just have the next slide, please? Just before you do go, I wanted to mention that DVSA's official guide to better driving has just been republished in recent weeks. It's now in its second edition. You might have bought the first edition. If not, it's well worth taking a look at, because it really does start to dig into some of the sort of the behavioural and attitude things that we've been talking about this evening. And if you use the code that's on the screen, BD20, you will get a 20% off discount on both the book and the new e-learning that's now available as well. So that's a brand new piece of e-learning that has launched. As Graham mentioned, we have got a survey that we've linked to in the chat. So if you wouldn't mind, please just giving us a minute just to give us some feedback on how today's gone. It will help us make these better for you next time. I'd just like to finish by thanking Amanda and Graham for taking you through everything today and sharing their expertise with you, to the team behind the scenes here who have been making everything work, but most of all to you for all joining us and giving up an hour of your time on this November evening. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of the evening. We hope to see you on one of these webinars again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.